Hey guys, it's Sarah Norris
And Carrie Eink
from the Star Institute for SPD, and we're live again to kind of answer some more questions that you guys have. So we got a question from Richard that was about his son, who gets a lot of good activity, it sounds like, but just has a hard time calming down afterward. I really liked the description of not being able to find his battery compartment. He's like the Energizer Bunny. I think those of us that either experience dysregulation or take care of someone that has those challenges can really relate with that analogy. So I think that was a really clever way to put it.
Yeah, it's a great question. Sarah and I both got excited to talk to you all about this because it is a question that so many of our parents, our adults, our teenagers, this is a question we get all the time. How come when I'm doing these certain activities that might have been that I read online, that I read in a book, that I was told by a certain therapist that I was supposed to do, why don't they always work? And if they work for a little bit, why don't they continue working throughout the day?
So it's not a simple answer because it does vary by individual. It depends on what you're sensitive to, what your body needs in any given moment, and all the other things that you've been exposed to over a period of time, because our sensations aren't discrete to each moment in time. They kind of have this cumulative effect over time. So, what might be working right now may not work tomorrow or may not even work the next minute. So it can be really hard sometimes to tease apart why things don't work the way that they sometimes do.
Yeah, prior to working at STAR, I would consistently implement what I learned about sensory diets and trying to find these activities that I could give the parents to do at certain times of the day. And what I was finding was sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't, sometimes they were very confusing, sometimes the kids would refuse them, or the teens or adults would say, I just woke up one day and I didn't want to do any of those. Coming to STAR, kind of the model that we implement here is thinking about more of a sensory lifestyle instead of necessarily just the same kind of sensory diet every day.
And so a really important aspect of developing a sensory lifestyle is developing some self-understanding or understanding what's going on with the person that you're caring for. So it's not enough to know he has trouble with touch, so we're going to work on these touch activities. What's really important to figure out and work with a therapist in determining is what properties are helpful, what are challenging, when to challenge, and when to support. So it's kind of this very delicate balance of figuring out not only what activities to do, but when to do them and why to do them.
Yeah, so what we start out talking about with families often, or with individuals, and something we talk about in our Sense webinar in one of the weeks, is arousal regulation, which is a pretty big term just to talk about how do I get my arousal in that just right place. And I know we've talked about that in previous videos as well. We had the little visual that had the blue zone and the green zone and the yellow zone and the red zone. But talking about how do I get in that just right place where I can do the things I need to do, I can think, I can focus. So what we start talking about is what types of activities are alerting, which ones make your arousal go up, go faster, what kind of activities are calming, so what kind of activities bring your arousal down, and there are this other group of activities that are organizing, which is one of the groups of activities that occupational therapists like the best. What types of activities bring your arousal to that just right place? So if you're too high, if you're too low, they kind of bring you to that just right place. And it isn't so easy as just reading a list. These kind of activities vary from individual to individual, depending on a whole slew of things, like what is your sensory profile, how much sleep did you have the night before, what type of diet are you eating, are you sick, are you not sick, do you have a big event coming up, are you in a big life transition. There are so many factors that can't be reduced to just one kind of sensory diet for all, and that's really where occupational therapists, I think, using our knowledge and using our training, that's where we really are good at kind of working with you on teasing out all of those different areas.
So one of the things that I hear really frequently, and I think is really similar to the problem that Richard is experiencing with his son, is that individuals that use sensory activities will have the effect that's intended, but then they'll go too far. So they might be feeling a little bit grouchy and understimulated and they need stimulation, but once they start to get that stimulation, they don't know when they've had enough and they go too far and they get overstimulated. Or they're feeling kind of anxious and stressed out and they need to calm themselves down, but they have this tendency to go too far and become really groggy and grumpy because they've gotten too much of that downregulation. So that activity that will bring them that calming sensation. So that's where it does take some tweaking for each individual to figure out. So one of the strategies I like to use with teens is talking about resting and revving. So yeah, after a hard school day, you do need a chance to decompress, but you're going to have to kind of wake yourself back up before you do your homework. And thinking about maybe you need to actually energize yourself before you can calm down because you're just so out of whack arousal wise.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think another point on this is thinking about sensory discrimination. That's another point we talked about before coming on. So first and foremost, you have to understand, where am I on that arousal curve? When you're a parent having to, work with your child on this, they might not always be the best reporter on, I feel a little bit groggy right now. I feel overstimulated right now. Even as we become adults, and if we have SPD, that is still a really hard thing to do, to know, where am I on the arousal curve? Am I in that yellow zone? Am I in that blue zone? And what I find starting to work with some of these individuals is that that's not so easy as it sounds, just talking about it. Even trying to do that with, with yourself as a parent or as a spouse, trying to think about, am I feeling revved up right now? Am I feeling groggy? And what we find is that in teens and adults, it can sometimes be split, where your brain can be racing in a high arousal state, but your body's hanging out in that low arousal state. So that's especially where some of those organizing individualized activities can be really helpful in understanding. So it like Sarah said, it just becomes really complicated and really individualized for the person.
One other thing I really think about often when this challenge is something that I'm discussing with a family is thinking about establishing flow. So for a lot of our individuals that have sensory processing challenges, just coming up with an idea, making it happen, it's exhausting. So by the time you actually have an activity set up or a sensory strategy in place, actually doing it enough times for it to be effective can be really challenging. So you might try it once or twice and be exhausted and be like, forget that, that didn't work. But what you might need to actually do is do it several times over several days to actually start to get the benefit of it. And that can be really tricky, especially when you're trying to figure out what works with a child, because they are the Energizer Bunny and it's hard to track why they're responding the way they are and should I try that again or not. And so that's why working with a therapist is really, really important, so that they can help you fine-tune of maybe we need to simplify how complex this activity is so it's easier to implement and that you're able to do it repetitively enough that your child or yourself can benefit from it.
Yeah, this reminds me of a great conversation I had with a family last night. I'm working with a preteen, and her whole life has learned about alerting activities, calming activities, organizing, but they just weren't working at all at home. And what we found the missing link was that they weren't very fun to her anymore, because she's getting older, and just spinning around on a disc or just swinging back and forth didn't have any fun or flow associated with it. So we're starting to work on that discrimination of, this was actually fun, which helped me actually bring my arousal up, not in an artificial way. And that's just starting to work on that kind of that flow discrimination. You could almost think of it, what does make me feel good in all the different aspects?
And so part of the work that goes in with these individuals that have the discrimination challenges is figuring out what's too much and then backing that off and figuring out what is the right amount. Because a lot of times they need incredible amounts of intensity to be able to even determine if it's something they like or they don't like, or if it works or doesn't work. And so they often have to kind of push it to the extreme and become the Energizer Bunny, get a little bit too overstimulated, before we know, okay, that was too much. Maybe we need to slow down or change something to bring that intensity down just a little bit. And it does take time and some finesse to be able to find that balance. So individuals that have discrimination challenges with sensations, they really have a lot of tricky factors that complicate what they like and don't like.
Yeah, so I think to kind of sum up your question, Richard, as you can tell, it's one that was very relevant and such a great question that I think will resonate with so many other individuals and families. But I really think working with an occupational therapist who gets this and can kind of work with this and discriminate for you and for your child, again, this is a really hard process to do. As a parent, as a sibling, as a spouse. This is a really hard thing to really be able to discriminate for somebody else, especially as your child is learning to do that. So I think working with a professional and figuring out, okay, what does just right look like? What does a little bit too far look like? What does way too far look like? And what do we do in all those situations? Kind of more some of those theoretical concepts I think will be really helpful in kind of starting you on this process of answering your question.
And then also thinking about more of that sensory lifestyle perspective of thinking about, do you understand why your son needs these sensations? And do you understand how they help him? And do you understand why he responds the way he does to them? That's really critical information that does change over time. So it takes a lot of time to really truly digest and understand. So again, having a therapist or someone who can walk you through that process is really, really helpful.
Yeah, so we're really excited. This is part of the topic of what we talked about on our Sense group. That'll be launching in a couple weeks, and we're really excited about that. We kind of walk through this process of arousal regulation, sensory lifestyles with some of the adults we work with. So that'll be coming out in a couple weeks. You can stay on the lookout for that. It'll be posted on our Facebook page.
Yeah, Carrie's, for those of you that weren't with us last week, Carrie's referring to a webinar that she and I have been putting together that's specifically for adults with sensory processing disorder or sensory processing challenges that just want more information about what's going on to hopefully help fuel their understanding of themselves and their own process that they're going through. So yeah, definitely keep your eyes out for that. We're really excited about starting more communication around that with all of you guys.
Thanks, guys.